Hello. Thank you for joining us here today at Kindred Church. I'm so glad we get to spend this time together. Today's question is one about compassion. Now, one of the things I love most about Jesus and his teachings is the simplicity. In Matthew 22, Jesus says it this way: it's not that complicated. Simply love God and love people. If you do that, you'll fulfill everything God requires of you. In the Old Testament, the prophets taught something very similar. It says in Micah 6:8, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God?" Now, it turns out that even some of Jesus' biggest adversaries understood these realities. They just had a hard time practicing them. And that really is the trick, isn't it? Do we practice what the Bible actually says? Now, on the occasion that we're going to be looking at today, the story of the Good Samaritan, what prompted that story is there was an expert of the law, a religious professional known as a scribe, who asks Jesus a question. Luke tells us that his motive was to test Jesus. However, to start this conversation, the religious expert calls Jesus teacher. Now, we might think of that phrase as him trying to pay honor or some kind of respect towards Jesus. But I think we should probably hear that with a little sarcasm. He was trying to give this teacher a test. This properly educated religious professional, he was someone who had the equivalent of a PhD in Mosaic law, was testing this popular but uneducated, unofficial, unsanctioned teacher. He was trying to expose to the crowd that Jesus couldn't handle a tough theological question. And the scribe's question was this: what must I do to inherit eternal life? Now, Jesus was asked that exact same question on a number of other occasions. One example is by a rich young ruler. But his motive, the rich young ruler, was different. On that occasion, Jesus answers the question in a very straightforward manner because the man was sincere. He really did want to know what he must do. But here, Jesus, he had this ability to turn this scribe's question back on him. In other words, Jesus says, "You're the expert. Don't you know the answer to that?" And this religious professional just couldn't resist the opportunity to demonstrate his theological sophistication. He responds, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Now, that's a good answer. It really is. It's, in fact, the exact same answer Jesus gave on another occasion when someone asked him what the greatest commandment was. Those two things sum up everything that was taught in the Old Testament. So Jesus commends him. He says, "You have answered correctly," which is, to me, kind of funny because Jesus has now assumed the role of instructor. He is now the authority in this relationship. He says, "You are correct. You get an A+ for that answer." But Jesus doesn't stop there. He adds, "Do this and you will live." So apparently this man was an expert in knowing, but not in doing. Jesus was saying that it isn't enough to know the right answer. You must also do it. Bernard of Clairvaux, otherwise known as Saint Bernard, he was the co-founder of the Knights Templar. You've probably heard of them. He was also a Benedictine priest who was a reformer of the Benedictines. But he once wrote this: There are those who seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That is curiosity. There are those who seek knowledge to be known by others. That is vanity. Then there are those who seek knowledge in order to serve. And that is love. So after Jesus, who is now the teacher in this relationship, gives this religious scholar his instruction, then comes the man's next question. Luke explains in Luke 10, verse 29, but the scribe wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Now, what's the motive? What do you think the motive is in saying something like that? It sounds like, to me at least, that he's looking for an excuse to not have to love certain people. So he's trying to defend himself by narrowing that definition of neighbor. And the first century Jews had a definition that was already pretty narrow. They defined it as one who is near. But they didn't mean someone who is near geographically or spatially. They meant culturally, those who were racially or religiously near, meaning that to this scribe, a neighbor was someone who was like him. Jesus pointed this out in the parable of the prodigal son when he says that the younger brother, where did he go? He moved to a far away country. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that it was a long distance away. It means that he quit living a good Jewish life and spent his time with Gentiles and moved into Gentile neighborhoods. So if a person doesn't look like you, act like you, believe like you, vote like you, then in their mind, they're not a neighbor. And thus the law of love simply does not apply. And according to Jewish law, you were not required to love those people because they were not your neighbor. So this religious leader is challenging Jesus on something that is absolutely fundamental. He is asking Jesus for his definition of the boundary markers of God's kingdom. Who's in, who's out. And contrary to popular opinion, this story is not about helping people in need. It is primarily about excuses and self-justification. And notice that Jesus never really answers this man's question, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. Let's first look at the characters of this story. First, there is the victim. We are told about a man who was just walking down the road. He's going from Jerusalem to Jericho, minding his own business. When out of nowhere, he not only gets robbed, he gets stripped naked and beaten within an inch of his life and then just left for dead. They just leave him in a ditch on the side of the road. And then soon comes along the second character, the priest, which was a highly respected and very important office in Israel. They represented the people before God in the temple and offered all the various sacrifices that were prescribed by the law. And we're told that he didn't stop. He just kept walking by. Next came along was this Levite, a sort of an assistant priest, or in our terms, kind of like a deacon. Not quite as respected as a priest, but still highly honorable position. They took care of the temple and assisted the priests in their duties. And just like the priest, he walked on by. Then comes the Samaritan. And if you listen closely to the story, if you're in this story going along, you could almost hear the gasp of the crowd as Jesus tells this story. Remember that this is just a story that Jesus is making up. He could have chosen anybody to be the hero, and the story would have been just as challenging, or at least challenging enough for the audience, if the last traveler had just been an ordinary Israelite who ended up being more helpful than a religious leader. Then it would have been a good parable against religious hypocrisy. But at least it wouldn't have been as insulting and offensive as it became. So why were the Samaritans so insulting? Well, 700 years earlier, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. We're told they carried thousands of Israelite captives away into exile, and those people were never heard from again. They're referred to as the lost tribes of Israel. However, the area of the northern kingdom was then resettled with people from other parts of the Assyrian Empire. And the Jews that remained behind and all the foreigners that moved in, they intermarried like people do. They had children. They became their own group of people. Their descendants were the Samaritans of Jesus' time. They were despised. They were hated by the Jews, especially the Jews in Jerusalem. The Jews considered them to be half-breed heretics. The racial and religious contempt between these two groups was intense, and at times it was even violent. Now, it might be easy to write this scenario off as being irrelevant because we're neither Jews or Samaritans, but think about all the horrors over the centuries that have grown out of ethnic loathing, nationalistic selfishness, religious tribalism. Think about all the stories of hatred and brutality and war. Think about all the hostilities in the world that are connected to racial hatred, economic oppression, and gender discrimination. Think about how our world could be so different if people just embraced this one teaching of Jesus, that we are all the family of God. But the Jews didn't get that. They couldn't deal with that idea. So when a Samaritan is used as the hero, these people are offended. In this story, the Samaritan man chose to take a detour to help this man. But that required 4 things. And these are 4 things that I want us to keep in mind, because they're still required today if you want to reach people, if you want to be compassionate towards people. Number 1, risk. This man put himself at risk. That 17-mile road from Jerusalem to Jericho, it was notorious for having a number of robbers that just hung out along the way. It wound its way through the desert, through all these rocky countries, and offered great places to hide. Traveling this road alone was seen as a foolish choice. It made you just an easy target. Even if you didn't have any money, thieves would attack you for whatever you had on you, and even if it was just the clothes on your back. In Jesus' time, the people called it the way of blood. So when this Samaritan man stopped to help, he was only increasing his potential for danger. He was putting himself at risk. Those robbers that just beat this dude up and left him for dead, they could still be close by. In fact, this could be one of their tricks. But that didn't matter to the Samaritan man. He didn't use risk as a justification for not acting. Have you ever used risk as an excuse not to act? Granted, there are some risks that probably aren't worth taking. They're not smart. Like if you're driving alone through the desert and you see a sign that says hitchhikers may be escaping inmates, then you see a guy in an orange jumpsuit with his thumb up. Picking that person up probably isn't just risky, it's just not very smart. But can we admit that most of the time, Our problem isn't that we are taking too many risks. Our problem is that we don't take any risks at all. Being wise is good. I'm not trying to argue that at all. But being loving is even better. Christ followers are called to be, according to the standards of this world, foolish with regards to loving people. Martin Luther King once, when talking about the story of the Good Samaritan, said, "The first question the priest and the Levite asked themselves, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But the Good Samaritan reversed the question, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him?" So if we are going to be good neighbors, if we're going to learn to love our neighbors, we can't use risk as an excuse of why we're holding back. So the first thing the Samaritan was willing to do was take a risk. Second was personal investment. The Samaritan inconvenienced himself to help this man. He stopped and took pity on him. That's what we're told. Now, pity is kind of a cold word to use in this text. The original word is better translated as tender compassion. He stopped when he saw this naked man dying in a ditch and felt tender compassion for him. That feeling alone is emotionally inconvenient. When you connect with someone who is hurting on an emotional level, it can take a lot out of you. And a lot of times, if we're being really honest, we'd rather not deal with the troubling emotions that someone else is having, even if they're in extreme need. But this man's emotional connection, this Samaritan man's emotional connection, led him to not just ignore him, but to do something about it. He got off of his donkey, cleaned and bandaged his wounds. Then he put him up on the donkey, took him to a safe place. All of this was very inconvenient. The Samaritan didn't use the excuse of not wanting to get personally involved in helping someone in need. He didn't wait for someone else to do something because they're probably better equipped at it. He got down in that ditch, bandaged that man's wounds, and he probably came out of that gutter looking just as dirty and bloody as the man who got beaten up. And if we're going to love our neighbor, we can't use not wanting to get personally involved as an excuse to hold back. So that's number 2. Number 3, a third way we need to invest in people is with our time. The Samaritan, he delayed his business trip by a whole day to care for this stranger. Then he stopped again on his way back through town to check on him. Time might be the most common excuse that we have for not helping. In the culture that we live in, time is our most precious commodity. We live our lives with the thinnest of margin in our schedules. Even if we are compassionate people, we often convince ourselves that we don't have time to help. Social experiments indicate that time is the key factor influencing people's willingness to assist those in need. Time matters more than their level of compassion or religiousness, and ultimately it boils down to whether we have time to help. But if we're going to learn to love our neighbor, really love our neighbor, our greatest ability is availability. We can't use a lack of time as an excuse. We make time for all kinds of things that are completely unnecessary. So make some time to help someone in need. So the Samaritan man was willing to take a risk. He was willing to get involved. He was willing to invest their time. Then he also gave money. The Samaritan paid for a room at the inn. Then the next day he gave the innkeeper 2 silver coins and said, "Look after him. When I return, I'll reimburse you for any expenses that you may have." In other words, this Samaritan man gave his credit card number to cover all the incidentals. And we all know how expensive those minibar items are. Those 2 silver coins represented 2 days' wages. Sometimes it will take money to help someone in need. And if we're going to learn how to love our neighbors, we can't use money as an excuse to hold back. Now let's look at the way this story ends. Like I said, Jesus never really answered the question of who is my neighbor. He only did it in an indirect way. Our neighbor isn't necessarily someone who lives next door to us or across the street, nor is it the person who is like us culturally, race, or religion. Our neighbor is anyone who's in need. Our neighbor is anyone that we have the ability to help. But Jesus also did something else. He asked one final question of this religious expert. He said, "Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" And you can hear, if you listen to the sound of this scribe's voice when he responds, he says, "The one who had mercy on him." He couldn't even bring himself to say the Samaritan. Then Jesus told him, "Go and do the same." Do you hear what Jesus is saying? He tells this Jewish religious leader that he must go beyond being open to seeing the Samaritans as neighbors. If he desired to live a life of love, then he had to love all people, regardless of their race or religion. So Jesus changed the focus of the question from who is my neighbor to what kind of neighbor are you going to be? If we define neighbor as only those who are like us, those who are near us, people who are part of our own religious or ethnic community, then we will never, ever be able to push ourselves to really love people. Jesus is calling us to a love that is, in a way, unnatural. He is, in fact, calling us to have a love that is supernatural. And Jesus was relentless in pressing people to see 2 things. Number 1, loving people is the primary way that we love God. And number 2, this love for people must always take precedence over religious traditions or ethnic obstacles. So what kind of neighbor are you? I want you to think about these questions for just a minute. What kind of neighbor are you? Would you want you as a neighbor? Would you want to be the first one to show up on the scene of your accident? Our spiritual journey calls us to go beyond our religious routines, go beyond our to-do list, into a lifestyle of faith and action, a life that welcomes divine detours, welcomes opportunities to demonstrate God's love in simple ways to people who truly, truly need us. They need us to be Jesus to them. Are you willing to be a good, loving neighbor? I hope you will. And I hope to see you again real soon. You have a great day.